works. Okay, it works. Okay. Thank you, Marco, for being here. I think this is the biggest meetup for the Power BI user group in Cologne or at Cologne, but the most of them are not from Cologne. Yeah, everybody from different locations from Germany. And thanks for presentation of the DAX Studio. DAX Studio. I'm working with the DAX Studio, but I have no idea what I can do with this tool. At least. So I'm very happy that you are being here, and so I give no other one other thing. We are more than 39 people. If you have any questions, post it in the chat. If the question is very important, unmute yourself and ask the question. I think at the end we have some time to for a Q&A session, and yeah, that's it. I give the words to Marco.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Do you see also my video or just the screen? Are you able to see my video too?
No,
I think it's visible. No,
it's only the screen.
That's a good point. No, but the camera is on, so probably just.
I can see
okay.
the video.
Okay. So yeah, because now it should be in the list of the. Let me close this. I think you can choose who is viewing the video, the session. Can choose the window with the video with my voice, but actually most of the time I would spend on the demo. So let me introduce myself and this session. My name is Marco Russo. Here you see my email. I write content and I provide training on SQLBI.com, where you can find many books, articles, and tools for Power BI, DAX, analysis services, Power Pivot. So today we talk about DAX Studio, and the idea is to introduce all the features that you have, all the main features and the use cases that you can cover using this tool. This tool has been in development since 2012, something like that. I don't remember exactly the date of the first release. And the idea for DAX Studio is very simple. We wanted to have a tool that is for DAX, the language used in Power BI and analysis services in Power BI. The same tool that for DAX is SQL Server Management Studio for SQL, if you use SQL Server. At that time, we used to use analysis services rather than, we didn't have Power BI, and so it was just an enterprise tool, and so we needed a tool to manage a few things. But when Power BI came into the market, we just increased by 10 times the number of potential users of this tool, just because Power BI internally runs an instance of analysis services. And so all the features that we had in DAX Studio were also available for Power BI. And the idea is that it's a tool that helps you write in DAX, test in DAX, optimize in DAX, and also for certain features, it's also useful to analyze your data model. So even though you don't use DAX at all, you just import data and you create relationships, you can see information in a very easy way that helps you saving memory, optimizing your model, even though you don't use DAX. So this is just the history of the tool and name. So what is DAX Studio? DAX Studio is an open source tool written in C#, available on GitHub, source code complete. You can just download the source code, compile, and have your own version if you want. Or, of course, you can just download the installer, the MSI, and install on your machine. Once you install DAX Studio, you have this tool that I can show you. I can open DAX Studio now. And this tool asks you a connection to an existing database, which could be analysis services or Power BI or Excel. So for example, here on my machine, I have this PBIX file. which is a report with some data, everything in a single PBIX file. When I have this file open in my desktop, I can connect DAX Studio to that file. As you see, the list of the files I have here is the list of the windows of Power BI desktops that I have open in my machine. If I use the Visual Studio to create tabular models for analysis services, I will see here the list of the instances of Visual Studio that are open. But if you have analysis services or you have Azure Analysis Services, you can write here the connection string for your database. For example, here, if I connect to tab 19, I connect to my local instance of Analysis Services. And because Analysis Services has a list of, has one or more databases in memory, I can choose which database I want to connect to. So here I can connect it to this reclassification database, or I can connect to AdventureWorks, or I can connect it to calculation groups and so on. So I can easily switch between one database and another. So once I connect it to a database or to an instance of Power BI Desktop, I have a number of tools available. And these tools help me write index code, run index code, test index code, optimize index code. That's the idea. But in 2020, we have now a much easier way to connect to Power BI. So one way to connect to Power BI is what I just shown you. Open Power BI, then open DAX Studio, and then from DAX Studio connect to Power BI. But if you have the latest version of Power BI and you install the latest version of DAX Studio, you have in external tools an icon DAX Studio. And if you click this icon, what happens? You immediately open DAX Studio connected to this instance of Power BI. Now, as long as Power BI Desktop is open, this is a live connection that you can use. And the first thing we can do in DAX Studio is writing some DAX code. So you see that there are several areas, but the idea is that I can write a DAX query here, and I can run the query, and I can see the result here. So let me try. How can I write a query? If you know DAX, you know that evaluate is the only statement in DAX that can run a query. And after evaluate, you have to write a table expression in DAX. And what is the simplest table expression you can write? The name of a table. Currency. You see, we have a IntelliSense that helps me completing the code, and then I can run, and I can see the result here. Now, we have a few features in DAX Studio. You can see that I can zoom this area. I'm just pressing Control and the mouse wheel. This is a feature for those of you that have to do some presentation, basically. And the same happens, the same works here and here. So in every window of DAX Studio, you can use this technique to zoom the code. I'm just dumping the code of the currency table, just like I will do in SQL, writing select star from table name. And so this is the first feature of DAX Studio, running a query. But why should I use this? I mean, if I am a Power BI user, I don't actually use this syntax. I never write this syntax in Power BI. Well, I don't write this syntax, but Power BI does this for me. Let me show you one thing. This is my report. And when I click on some slicer in this report, so for example, if I click on Contoso, you see that the content of this report changes. What happens when I click on a value in the slicer? If I enable here in View Performance Analyzer this recording, at this point, any action I do over the report is tracked here. Let me show you. So if I click on AdventureWorks here, you see that there is an event, changes the slicer, and there are 4 operations that have been executed. Each of these operations updates a single visual. For example, this is the slicer here. This is this visualization. There is another visualization here, and so on. Each of these visualizations displays some data, But in order to display this data, what happens? A single DAX query, one or more DAX queries, has been sent to the engine that provided a result with the data that had to be used to populate the visual. For example, here I see numbers represented by dots with a bigger or smaller diameter, and some number here in the tooltip. But actually, if I click on this visual here, you see that when you click the visual here, you see that this sales amount by country corresponds to this visual, because when you click here, you see that this area is highlighted. So if I copy the query here, I copy the query in the clipboard. Now I go back to DAX Studio and I paste the code here. I just change the zoom to show you that this is the query that I copied from Power BI. But this query has been sent from Power BI to the engine, and if I click run, I can see the result of the query. So this is the result that has been received by the visualization of Power BI, and it has been used to populate the map. So in order to populate this map, these 6 lines have been received by Power BI. Every visualization has a different query. And so the first thing we can do is, well, we can copy DAX code that we didn't write, and we can run it, for example. And the editor we have here allows us to do several things. For example, let's say that I recognize, maybe not in this visual, but let's take a look at this visualization, right? So let's say that the top 10 customer here, let me copy this query. When I run this query, I say, well, I know that for some reason this number is wrong. I know that the value for this customer should be another one. So I realize that the numbers that I see in the report are not the right ones. So when you recognize that, you can do something like this. You can recognize that the sales amount is the measure invoked here in this query. Remember, pretend that I don't know DAX, but I recognize that the sales amount is the name of my measure. And I don't know the DAX code here, but I know that sales amount is a measure I wrote. If I search this measure here, you can see that here you have the ability to filter in the metadata pane the list of measures columns that you have. So I can click on sales amount. But sales amount is a measure that I define in my model. Now I can go back to Power BI. I can search for sales amount here. And I can click here, and I can see the code here. And sales amount, I see sales amount has been defined with this SUMX. Okay? Now let me go back here. What happens if I right-click and I click on define measure? If I define a measure, I can obtain automatically a definition of the measure which is local to the query that I ran in DAX Studio. Now, because I defined sales amount locally to this query, this local definition of sales amount overrides the definition of sales amount I have in the model. So from here and after, any run of this query will use this definition of sales amount instead of the sales amount definition I have in the model. Now, if I run the query again, I don't see any difference, but oops, I don't see any difference. If you select an area and you click run, you run only the selection. So because I have a complete query, I want to execute everything. But to show you that I'm doing I'm actually overriding this. Let me write here 100. Okay, if I click 100, what happens? Now sales amount is always 100. So I have control. I can change the behavior of this measure. So now I pretend to know that when I look at the formula, I say, oh, wait a minute. I know now why my number 33 million is wrong, because this should not be net price, but unit price. And if I run this query again, now I see different numbers, and then I say, oh, now Isabella has the right number, and I pretend to fix my code. And so now we're looking at a second use case for DAX Studio, which is knowing only the syntax of DAX for writing a measure, I can modify the measure within a query without touching the measure definition in the model. This way, if I have to change a measure and I have to change a chain of measures, I can see the impact of my change without actually changing the measure in the real model. So I can simulate what happens if I change something without worrying about breaking something in the real model and without having to create a copy and then forgetting what I changed. So it's a safe environment to make your test, to run your code, to make your experiment, if you want. Now, this feature is very, very useful, and I want to show you another thing, which is, let me go back here. Say that I have margin, right? Margin is a measure that is defined as the sales amount minus total cost. Now, sales amount is another measure, total cost is another measure. And so if I want to see the definition of all these measures, I should repeat my task several times. Sales amount, right-click, define measure. You see that all the measures are copied in this area between model measure begin and end. But if you think about this, when you have a complex measure, like the margin percentage, you can say, I want to create the definition of all the measures that could be involved in the calculation of margin percentage. So if I click define dependent measures, what happens is that in a single click, you obtain all the measures that can contribute to this calculation. This is the only way you can actually change the behavior of margin by changing sales amount. What I mean is that, look at what happens if I write here. Let me add here another column just to show you the difference. So if I write here margin and margin. Okay. So if I run the code now, you see two columns. Now let me comment these two measures here. So you see that I'm only defining sales amount and total cost here. Now, if I change the sales amount using unit price, you will see that sales amount changes, but margin does not change. Let me try. So if I run this, you see that actually, because the order changes, you have to pay attention. Look at Isabella. So let me restore net price. We have to see, okay, if you see this number, 16,754, okay, if I change this to unit price, what happens? It's still the same number, even though the sales amount now is different. Why this? Because the margin measure here is invoking the margin measure in the model. And the model still uses sales amount in the model. So if I want to modify sales amount and I want to backpropagate the changes of sales amount to all the derived measures, I have to include all the measures here. So this is something that could be confusing in the beginning, but once you understand the principle, the idea is that you have to go to the more complex measure, define dependent measure, and so you make sure that you have all the measures involved in the calculation. At this point, when I have net price, the original number, 33,754. When I change to unit price, you will see that Isabella here will have a different number. Indeed, 19,000. So you see that by changing now sales amount, I also affect the margin percentage because the measures that are local to the query affect the other calculations that are local to the query. Whereas the measures that are used by the model, they still use the definition in the model of the other measures. So if we didn't have this feature, define a dependent measure, we would have spent minutes just copying the formulas, the measure that we needed just to test the impact of changing a single measure. So this is what we do to use DAX Studio to test our code, to create a complex measure and validate the numbers. My experience is that when I write a formula and I have a complex calculation, usually I know some use case where I know the result I had to obtain. I just want to make sure that I obtain the right numbers before I deploy the measure to the model. And having a way to quickly change the measure, run the measure, change the measure, run the measure, and see the result saves time. And if you do the same in Power BI, you have more latency. Every time you enter a measure, sometimes you have to wait a few seconds just to validate the measures of the model. This is especially true when you have many measures in the model. Whereas here, the latency is zero. You don't have to wait any time because you are not actually changing the model. You're just running a query. And it is very, very fast. So it's about productivity. So this is the editor today. So just to highlight the limitations. When I write a measure here, so measure sales quantity, okay, test, and I write a SumX, you see some help, but this is far from being helpful like IntelliSense you have in Power BI. So for example, this IntelliSense, I can double click this and copy sales here. I can write the sales and quantity here, but I don't have the same quality of IntelliSense that you have in Power BI. You see that several times you don't get much help when you write the code. This is going to change in the future. Believe me, there is a lot of work going on to have a proper syntax validation IntelliSense, just not ready now. So in the future, in a few months probably, you will get a much better experience. So this is to say that if you're used to the IntelliSense in Power BI, you make a step back when you go in DAX Studio. But when you know your model when you know well enough your data model, you basically just want to modify some measure, and at this point, DAX Studio is very, very productive. I didn't mention other useful things. For example, here, you see that when I go over a table, I see the number, just the number of columns of the tables. But when I move over a column, I can see the sample data of this column. So for example, what is in a customer city? And you see here 10 values that have been retrieved by that customer city column. Continent, company name. Sometimes the name of a column is confusing and you would like to take a look at what is the content of the column. And when you have a table with a lot of columns, opening the table with all the columns, you should spend some time finding the column. Here is much easier. It's easier to find a column and see what you have inside. We think this is another feature that is useful. But what else can I do here? So as you see, there is a tool here called Query Builder. So far, I said, okay, I can write a query because I know DAX and I know evaluate and the syntax. Or I can copy a query from Power BI. Or I can create a query with a Query Builder. This is a relatively new feature in DAX Studio. And how does it work? It's very version 1, but let's say that I want to get by brand, color, and calendar year. I want to see the sales amount. So sales amount. Here we go. And now I run the query and I see the result. But of course, I can also take a look at the query. And I can add a filter. So let's say that I want to filter by, I don't know, brand. No, let's use the category. And the category contains TV. And let me see the query now. So yes, it should work. So let me remove this one. I don't need this one. And I can run this one. And so here I have a query that has TV in the description of the category. So probably I want to also see the category here to make sure that I'm doing the right thing. Edit query again and sorry. Edit query again and run. Yes, and I have my category is TV and video that contains TV and nothing else. So again, if I don't know DAX, I can use this as a starting point to create my query. Why should I use this query, by the way? Well, two use cases. Everything you have after evaluate, you can get this code as is after evaluate. You can go to DAX Studio and you can create a calculate table. So if I create a calculate table with this code, I get exactly the same result. So if for any reason you need to create a calculate table with some code that is the result of a query, it's easy to obtain without knowing too much DAX. Or you use Excel. You can copy this query in Excel and get a table with all the data that you want, for example. We also have other ways to export data this way. And by the way, if you have feedback about this, because this is a feature we have to understand whether it is useful or not for the user. And finally, you could use this query in paginated reports. So the query you create here, you can copy and paste this query in paginated report, and you can create a paginated report using the same query. So these are the several use cases for this. And as I said, this feature is really the beginning, is the version 1. So there will be improvements in the future, and hopefully also better integration with the paginated report tool. So while I was working, I didn't show you that every time I run a query, the query is stored here. There's a history of the queries that I ran in my session. This list is lost once you close DAX Studio, so it's not. But this could be useful to see how much time you spent running the query with additional information that now are not recorded because we are not debugging about the performance that I will show you in a moment. So I think I'm not spending time for the obvious features like you can select the code, the comment, and comment. You know, these are features that are easy to find. But of course, you have an integration with DAX Formatter. So you can just get the query and format the query. And you can also choose whether you want to use the short line or the long line formatting. Now, when you click Format Query, you're calling a web service. So if you don't have an internet connection, that button will not work. And now, by experience, I know that many people use DAX Studio in a way that has nothing to do with running the query. And I can show you one thing. For example, here, I go to this file, which is one of the files of a new DAX pattern we just released. And I paste the code here just to show you that I have seen many people doing this. They probably have some code that is not formatted properly. So something like this, and this, and so on. And they paste the code. So they copy the code from Power BI, they paste the code here, they format a query, and then they copy and paste back to Power BI. You can imagine this is something that we will automate in some way, so you don't have to copy and paste every time. But that's one idea that, I mean, this is a use case that I have seen used often. And sometimes people use this for another reason, because when you have a complex formula, people find the editor of DAX Studio better than the one in Power BI. Yes, you don't have IntelliSense, but at the same time, it doesn't stop you when you want to move around, or, you know, in Power BI, you have this problem that whenever you want to move around, you lose the position where you are in the formula, and you go back and you open. You cannot split this into another screen. So if you want to see, for example, this, you want to see the diagram view while you are editing the formula. If you have two screens, or you have a large screen, you can work side by side, something that you cannot do in Power BI, for example. This is just one of the many things that we have. Okay, so now that we have seen these features, we can start to explore some other options. Oh, by the way, I forgot another thing. evaluate currency, I just want to show you that so far I've shown you that when I run the query, I see the result here in this window, but actually you can transfer the result to a file, or you can run the query just to measure the timing without getting the result. So imagine you have a query that runs very slow, but produces a lot of rows. You don't want to see the result, you just want to measure the performance. So you can just click timer, and at this point the query runs, but the DAX Studio doesn't receive the result. Just run the query and see what is the time required to run the query. Or I can choose a file, which means that now when I run the query, instead of looking at the result here, I save the query into a CSV file or a comma separated text file or a custom export format that you can configure in the option of the product. Believe it or not, we have seen people exporting millions of rows with this tool, which is the only tool that allows you to do that, because if you try to export the data from Power BI, you have limits. If you try to import data in Excel, you have a limit of 1 million rows. So if you have 2 or 3 million rows you want to export from Power BI for any reason, you can actually do this exporting to a CSV file. It just works, and it is relatively fast. It has been optimized following the request of several users. So this is the output tab. So now we have to see what we have in advanced, and then I will talk about the performance. So first of all, if you just want to export data, because if you have to write a query, okay, this makes sense. But imagine that I just want to export my tables. I can go in export data, and I can say, okay, I want to export data into CSV files. I want to store everything in temp, and I want to save all the tables or just customer and date. Okay? And you export. So this way, in a single click, you export all the tables in CSV files, all the tables that you want, and so on. Another very useful feature. And now we can talk about this area, which is metrics. So how can I know where I have my data, where I'm storing more data, and so on? This button, View Metrics, is an integration between Vertipack Analyzer and DAX Studio. So Vertipack Analyzer in version 1 was an Excel file that was connecting to a data model, a tabular model, or Power BI model, and was retrieving statistics about your model. In version 2, we implemented Vertipack Analyzer as a set of libraries that you can get from NuGet, and you can implement in any tool. And DAX Studio uses this library to run the same queries, retrieve the same statistics, and display these statistics in an internal visualization, but also enables you to export these statistics in a standard file. Let me show you. First of all, if I click on View Metrics, I see this. I see that my model has 12 million rows in a sales table. The cardinality at the table level is the number of rows of the table. When I expand each table, I see the columns of the tables. And for each column, I see how many unique values I have in each column and what is the size of each column. Because Power BI stores data in a compressed way in memory in a columnar database, which stores data in a compressed way column by column, which means that depending on the column, you might have better or worse compression. For example, the 12 million rows for the online sales key column, which is an integer column that has a unique value for every row, requires 97 megabytes. And the entire sales table is 300 megabytes. So 30% of the table is just one column. Then we have the order number, which has 1 million of unique values and other 80 million rows. 80 megabytes, not 80 billion bytes, 80 megabytes. And you see that the other columns, like for example, the net price has only 2,000 rows and it requires 12 megabytes. And you think that you have 12 million rows, this means that that column is just 1 byte on average for every row. But there are columns that are much smaller. For example, the promotion key is so much compressed that is only 10 kilobytes for 12 million rows. So you see that the size of each column really depends on the number of unique values you have in the column and the distribution across the table. And the details you have here also they tell you whether the size is spent for the data, the dictionary, which is the list of unique values of the columns, and other structures like the hierarchy size, which is an internal structure for the sort order for MDX compatibility. So the number here is the sum of all these numbers. And what you can easily get, you can easily find the columns that you don't use, but that are expensive. For example, this online sales key probably is a column I don't need. I can just remove it. I'm not using this column. And when I see that it is 30% of my table, I can get rid of this column. Not only this is 30% of my table, if you look at this visualization, you can see all the columns of all the tables. And you can see immediately here, this is the more expensive, these two are the more expensive columns of the entire data model. And if I go to summary, I can see that the entire model is 300 megabytes in memory. So the PBX file could be smaller, but once you load this file in memory, usually there is a bigger memory consumption. And what you see in view metrics is the memory consumption. Now, this information, you also have information about the relationships and the partitions. In this case, we have only one partition for each table because it's a Power BI desktop file. But in analysis services, you could have multiple partitions for a single table, or in a Power BI Premium, you could create multiple partitions. Now, why should you use this tool? Two reasons. Three reasons. First reason, I just want to find columns that are too expensive. Second reason, I want to know my model better, because only knowing how the data is distributed across my model, I can understand the metrics I will see when I run a single query for optimization. So the metrics for the analysis part of the query require me to know what is the size of each column, the number of unique values in each column, in each table, because otherwise I cannot say that whether a number I will see later is too big or too small. It depends. It always depends on the model. Third, my model could be gigabytes in analysis services or hundreds of megabytes. And by the way, my model could contain sensitive data. But I may need to provide to a consultant, or I as a consultant should receive statistical information from a database that is in production. Now, I have two options. I can connect to the server, but usually I don't have access. There is a firewall. There are too many. I'm not authorized to see the data, for example. This is another problem. Or I can ask to an administrator who is authorized to access to the physical database to export the metrics. Now, export metrics is a saving. So let me Contoso 2020. Okay, I'm saving in temp this VPAX file. Okay. And what is this VPAX file? Let me show you. It's a small file. It's a very small file, which is just 50 kilobytes in this case. Now, this file doesn't contain any data. It contains the data model, the definition of the tables, the columns, the measures, and the statistics about the data model. So the size of each column, the number of rows, without the data. I don't know what is the name of a customer, but I know that there is a column called customer and customer name, and that column has 10,000 unique customers, and it requires a few hundred megabytes. I know this. And this is a zip file. So if you want to make sure that you are not disclosing any sensitive information, you can open this as a zip file, and you can inspect the files that you have here, which are text files, JSON files. And if you will look at the content of these files, you will see that there is no sensitive data at all. I just show you one of these files. just to take a look, but is only to demonstrate that we have, let's open with a notepad. We just have a JSON file with information, the same statistical information you have seen in the previous visualization. Now, what is the advantage of this file? It's small, doesn't have sensitive data. I can send this by email to my consultant, and my consultant can open DAX Studio without connecting DAX Studio to any database. So I'm opening a fresh new instance of DAX Studio, not connected to anything. I can go to advanced. So I don't open any connection. I import matrix and I open my VPAX file. Now I see here the same information I was able to see before. Moreover, if you download the Vertipack Analyzer tool, which is an Excel file that can import the same VPAX file, you will see the same information in an Excel format, which also shows the list of the measures, the list of the calculated columns, so other information, other details that have been extracted this way. And I find that this is very, very useful for troubleshooting, for analysis. So, for example, when I'm asked to provide consulting to a customer, we don't even start any meeting before I receive this file. Once I receive this file, I know exactly all the metrics. And so I don't have to ask, what is the size of this table? What is the size of this table? Do you have this relationship? I don't need anything. I have everything here. Technically, I also have the bin file with all the details about the data model if you want. And so this is the part of the metrics, which is very, very useful. So now let's go back to the last part, which is what about the performance? So we have several tools about the performance, and you see we have a load performance data and we have this traces area here. So let me talk about the performance. The first thing is, what is this button, load performance data? So if you remember, I made a few operations keeping the performance analyzer open. The performance analyzer technically intercepts any operation made over a report and stores additional information about the query that has been run, the timing for the display, and many other details. Only part of these details is shown here. What you can do, you can export to a JSON file the session that you have in Performance Analyzer. So whatever I did here has been exported into a JSON file. This JSON file is documented by Microsoft in some article, but what you can do in DAX Studio, you can open this file. And when you open this file, you see the same information that you have seen in Power BI with a different visualization that I personally prefer. For example, here, you will never see other. You will never see that this information that is very confusing. This other is something that you really should ignore, because this is the time spent waiting for other visuals. You cannot do anything other than reducing the visuals. Whereas here, you can focus on the time spent to run the query, the time spent to render the visual, the total time, which is the sum of the two, ignoring other, because other is just something that could be useful if you see a Gantt chart of all these actions. But usually you just want to focus on these details. And you see here when the query starts, when the query ends, so in local time, and the query that has been run. So if I double click this, I simply copy here the same query that you had seen before. When I made copy and paste, I had the same query, but here you see in this comment additional information that we didn't have when we used the copy and paste. Okay. You can, of course, you can run the query again if you want, but the idea is that this PBI performance is a tool that enables you to read the file that you can save from Performance Analyzer. And of course, you have also filters. You can, when you have a large file, this is very useful because you can apply filters. You can, for example, filter only the events for a visual and see the timing for the same visual in different execution and so on. When you don't know where to start, you start looking at what is the slowest visual. But let's say that now we find a particular visual that has something that is slow. And let me make it slower so we can demonstrate the problem here. If I can. Top 10 customer. Let me see. Maybe this is not the best way to do this, but I can try. Okay, so I can do a stupid thing here. This way, I creating a very, very slow query this way. So you see that now this will take some more time to provide the same result. So if I go here and I go to total here, you see that the DAX query now run in almost 2 seconds. And also this one run in 1 second. Okay, we can get this one. And we can copy the query here. So let me run the query here. And you see that this is the result of a query. And the result of this query took 2.5 seconds to complete. So I definitely have a slow query. And I wanted to create something slow to show meaningful numbers in the next part. So when I have a single query or 2 or 3 queries in the same script that have a performance issue, I can start with these 2 buttons, 2 new panes to analyze a single query. So query plan and server timings are the 2 tools that we can activate to see what happens when we run a query. So if I click run again, this additional diagnostic provide this information in the query plan and in the server timings. So let's start with the query plan. The query plan is something that you usually don't use, but just to clarify. The engine provides information about the logical query plan, which is just like a definition of the steps that the query has to execute, not very useful. And then the physical query plan, that is the list of the operations that have been executed. So for those of you that know SQL, the physical query plan provided by DAX, by the DAX engine, corresponds to the actual execution plan of a SQL Server. So it's not what the SQL Server thinks will happen, is what happened, right? So this is actually the log of what happened during the execution of the query. The problem of the physical query plan, however, is that first, is you don't have a graphical layout of the query. Second, it could be very, very verbose. For example, here, the simple query has 86 rows, but you can easily find queries in a real report that have thousands and thousands of lines, which means that it's basically hard to use. So we usually rely on this other pane, which is server timings, that provides me, first of all, a complete description of the query here that says, okay, this query ran in 600 milliseconds, okay, because this was the second time I was executing the same query probably. And of this time, which is the total waiting time for the query, the execution was split between 2 parts of the engine, which are called the formula engine and the storage engine. And these 2 elements combined together are necessary to solve the query. Now, the reason why we see these 2 different numbers is because depending on the area that is lower in the query, we will focus our action to optimize the query in different ways. In this particular case, we have the formula engine running for 20% of the time and the storage engine for 80% of the time. And actually, the storage engine is waiting for half a second, but in reality, the storage engine consumed more than 1 second. Why? Because the storage engine can run on multiple cores at the same time, which means that the parallelism, so the degree of parallelism achieved by this query was 2.7. On average, this query used 2.7 CPUs in my machine. The formula engine is single thread. You can only optimize in parallel threads the storage engine. So usually it's a good idea trying to push the execution to the storage engine. But in this case, the storage engine is consuming too much time. Knowing my model, if you remember, if I go in metrics, my largest table is 12 million rows. I know by experience that a modeling with 12 million rows for the storage engine should be a query that runs in 20 milliseconds, 10 milliseconds, maybe 30 milliseconds, a very complex storage engine query. So my first problem is that when I see this number, I say, wait a minute, how is it possible I spent half a second to query a model of 12 million rows? It doesn't make any sense. There is a problem here. And if I look at the reason, you see that the storage engine executed two storage engine queries. A storage engine query is an internal call to the internal in-memory engine, or if you have direct query, you will see SQL code here, because the storage engine at the point would be your SQL server. But in this case, this data is loaded in memory, and I can see here that my 486 milliseconds have been spent for most of the part between these two queries, but this one was 300 milliseconds of duration. And if I look at the result of this query, without looking at the definition, this is a code that is an internal SQL representation of the internal execution, but is not real SQL. But what I see here is that the result of the storage engine query created a temporary table in memory with 309,000 rows and 25 megabytes of temporary table. So the reason why we spent half a second is because we created a temporary table in memory uncompressed with 300,000 rows. Why? Because I wrote a bad DAX code. Now, I don't want to enter into the DAX optimization here, but I just forced here a stupid calculation that provided more or less the same result, just to show a big performance issue that I now can solve. And now, because I changed this definition, if I run this query again, you see that the very same query returning the very same result now run in 18 milliseconds, which is what I expect. And the storage engine query scanning 12 rows is 11 milliseconds, which is what I expect. And by the way, we only have one storage engine query instead of two, which is another advantage. I try to reduce the number of storage engine queries in my calculation. So query plan and server timings are the two tools that provide information that you can use to optimize the query. And the value of these two panes is visible if you think about what you should do if you didn't have this tool. You should rely on SQL Server Profiler, which would provide for the same execution. So query processing, we should catch the query, storage query and cache match and query and I think that's enough. Query cube, query subcube. It should be enough. Okay. So if I run this profiler, I can show you what would happen. So let me clear the cache, because when I run, I actually clear the storage engine cache and then I run the query again. So I'm clearing the cache to have a fair execution here, because now I want to run the query again here, but probably now there is something not working. By the way, I can do this here. I can just change this here, and I can go back to the profiler, and you can see the events in the profiler. So the problem is that I should capture all these individual events, but then I should sum the value of CPU time. I should compare this with the value that I obtained from another event. So I should spend minutes just to do the math that I obtain in a very simple way in this pane. Now, probably I have a problem because I'm running different concurrent profiling session, which is not a good idea. But this is the reason why this is spinning. I probably have to stop this and move forward. But now I think we completed almost everything. And so these are, these are the features. I'm checking my list of features, and yeah, basically we covered almost all the features of DAX Studio. So DAX Studio is basically a tool that helps you write index code, test index code, and analyze the performance of DAX code for your model. But it's also a tool that helps you finding where you could have data that you're not using and getting more information about your data model. So I didn't receive any questions so far, which is strange, but I didn't check the window. So do you have some question? I don't hear anyone. So if you're talking, okay.
The unmute button was disabled. I think there was a question from Nicholas with any buttons you don't see in Power BI or in DAX Studio, sorry. Is it solved?
Sorry, what is the question?
The question is
yes,
Nicholas.
It is solved. Yeah. Yes, it is
Okay.
solved. I had to activate this preview feature with this advanced metadata model.
Oh, no, I thought there was another question from you.
Anyway. With those collapse buttons,
Yeah.
It was just a zoom thing in my in the left area in this tree.
Okay.
Okay.
Then there was a question from Jochen.
Just one thing. I forgot to mention, you're right. A few of the features that I've shown you, especially the external tools, I think Vertipaq Analyzer now is part of the, it's general release, but Query Builder and external tools for Launch Excel, Launch SQL Profiler are preview features that you have to enable here. Vertipaq Analyzer has a flag here that you can enable or disable, which included a complete tabular object model in the data that you export. I don't remember if the default is enabled or not. Maybe it's not enabled by default, or yes, I don't remember. But the idea is that this is not necessary if you just want the statistics. So if you include Tom, you included the beam file that actually creates the model. And the other thing is this number, sample of referential integrity violations. One of the metrics of Vertipaq Analyzer is the number of referential integrity violation, which means imagine that you have in the sales table the product key that doesn't exist in the product table. So this is a referential integrity violation. It's not a problem. The model works, but it's just a warning. You may want to know which are the products that are referenced in the sales table and don't exist in the product table. And so Vertipaq Analyzer can extract this list. Actually can extract a sample of these names, because if you have 1 million of names, you don't want to see them. And here you can write how many of them you want to include in the VPAX file. Now, I think that the default for this is 0, because or we don't export this by default, because this could be sensitive data. Imagine that you have the SSN code in the United States or a personal identifier in Europe that can be used to identify a customer or a vendor. You may not want to export it, right? You want to know that there are 3 violations. You don't want to see them, right? Because this could export sensitive data. So this is where you control this. And if you don't want to export sensitive data, set this to 0. Okay, sorry. Next question.
One question from me to the query analyzer, sorry, not the query analyzer, the SQL profiler. Is there also a way to profile a tabular model with X events? Because X events is more gives us more performance on the SQL server.
It's a complex question. So if you okay. If you run SQL Server Profiler, you're using the profiler events, which have a performance input. But if you're using this tool, you are probably just debugging a single query or a small thing. So you should not be concerned about this. if you have to run something in production, you definitely don't have to use the provider. You definitely have to use extended events. Yeah. You definitely do not have to enable extended events with the level of details we enable here. So even though, I mean, I'm saying, yes, you're right. You have to use extended events if you want to monitor something in production, but you are very wrong in enabling extended events at this level of detail. Don't do this, period.
Yeah, that's
okay?
right.
Don't do this in production. Because also with extended events, the events that are activated when you run the Vertipack the Vertipack queries, which are what we use to analyze, to debug a single query, they create large strings. They could create a huge performance issue for your server. It doesn't matter that you're using extended events. The problem is that the event by itself is so heavy and consumes so much memory. Don't do that. Because you should use this to debug a single query, it doesn't matter, because you run just a single query. So the difference between the provider and the extended events is nothing. You just run for a single query. So what's the problem? Okay. So it depends, but okay.
Yeah, that's right. I was not sure if extended events working with DAX or tabular instance. Okay.
We cannot use the extended events in Power BI. That's another problem. I mean, there are a number of details, but the DAX Studio uses the events because is the only thing we can reliably use in Power Pivot, Analysis Services, and Power BI. Extended events.
Okay. Yeah, I don't use this to in a production environment. Only QA or testing, and yeah.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Okay. Nicholas has raised his hand.
No voice.
We can't hear.
Okay.
No voice. No.
Thank you. Now you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes.
Now I can see you. I can hear you.
Okay. Thank you. I love this feature to check where column is referenced by other tables. But in my case, it doesn't work. So if I click a single row and I say show me the differences, it always says query started, and then it says I have to translate it because it's German. There was an unsupported dependency thing. So
you connected to Analysis Services, right?
No, to PBI. So to a Power BI model.
So can you copy the
yes, for sure. So a new one. So it's
if you copy in the chat window.
Yes.
Yeah.
Here you are. And so the model works. So
Yeah. I just have to understand how to download this copy. Maybe work. I tried to open and it doesn't open, so I have to copy and paste. I don't know.
That's how we work.
Okay.
So it's always the first red line there. There was an unsupported dependency thing. And that's it. It's so Philip knows the model. Yes.
You have the model. The model is imported in. So sorry, this happens only on one model or on any model you have?
No, on my big model. So I have one big model, and so I have a table.
It is imported in memory, right? So is a PBX with all the data in memory.
Yeah. Yes.
It's not connected to an external data.
No, it's all the data is imported. So I did this in two tables. I checked this, and everywhere it's the same. So.
Sorry, what is the meaning in English? This I'm trying to understand, because there is not. I hope that there was some code, but there is no error code here. So
it was an unsupported dependency.
Yes.
It was detected an unsupported dependency.
But this happens when you start a query.
Yes, I do a right click on the row, and I say, show me where this row is referenced.
Okay.
Yes.
You wait a minute. You're using another feature here. So you're, for example, you go here and you do this and you do this, right?
Yes, I would do this on the customer ID.
Okay. Okay.
On the
okay, I think that there is a, okay, so I don't remember, but I think, okay, there is something that has, I don't remember, there was a similar issue. If you go to GitHub Duck Studio, I suggest you to open the case here. There is an area with the issues. I show you here. Let me think, because I remember something, dependency.
Yeah, cannot detect, there was it, cannot detect the object references. Yes, the third line. Or now you.
This one.
Yes, this one. This seems like that. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah, there should be an issue.
But it worked in the former version. I checked it, but I did an update, and since then it doesn't.
Yeah, but you see, this is potentially connected to the new compatibility level and the enhanced metadata format. But actually, I have other models. I am not sure. I didn't test it.
Can't you check this in this Contoso if you if you check the references on the customer ID or the product ID?
Let me try in 1 second. So here, if I go here, and let me open also Tabulator, because I don't remember what is the version here, so we can also check the version.
Because this is very useful to me, this feature.
Yeah, but it's just is not a feature of Duck Studio. It's just a data management view that depends on the engine. So it actually depends. So let me see, where is my Duck Studio here? I lost the control here. Okay, so this one. So this one should be connected now. This is not necessary. So I go to customer. I go to country. I right click, show object references, run. And I don't see any reference. Okay, this makes sense. Let me get something that I use. So sales unit cost. So right click and run, and you see that this measure is a reference. So this is working. Let me check what is the version.
And if you do this on the product key?
On sales product key?
Yes, yeah, there's the product key.
Product product key or sales product key?
Yes, product key. Yes, that one.
Okay. This works. And product key, I think it works too. Yeah, it works. Okay. It works, but let me check. So here, the model is, oh, we don't have the model here. 5020 and it's 5020, yes. I don't know, this works, so okay. I'm not able to help you more. The only test I can do, I can say with another name. So Quantus, and then close and open it again, making sure I have the metadata, the enhanced metadata enabled, but I have, because otherwise I would not have this. Yeah, but it will not have opened Tabulator. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that it is saved with a new format. So the size by itself is not enough. It's something else that probably they've broken. By the way, no, I have the same build that you have here on this computer. No, I was thinking I could have had a more recent version, but I don't think this is the case. Let me check. Come on, oh, it's still working. But in a moment I will check the version. But yeah. Here we go. You have, let's see, about August 2020. You should have probably
Same one. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. So I had the hope to find something now.
Follow the issue that we have seen in GitHub. Because,
yes.
There will be some update here probably. If you want to give priority, try to open a ticket with Microsoft, because actually this is a behavior that is not working in the product, in the Power BI product, not in DAX Studio. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay. Do you have? Oh no. So there was also a question from Jochen. Jochen,
yep.
are you here?
Yes. Hi.
Yes. You had the question with when you get errors when you execute something.
Yeah. So Marco, I'm fighting always when I have a Power BI desktop model with a live connection to SSIS Tabular, and this is a very old version of SSIS. I think SQL 2012 or so. I have no admin rights.
No.
And often when I define visuals where I have filters to just exclude specific elements from a table, it crashes and visual shows unexpected error. And in that case, the performance analyzer will not record that query.
So it's not that, okay, I can tell you this. First of all, you should open a support ticket with Microsoft, and they should be able to assist you. Now, they will be in trouble because there is a big difference between 2012 and 2016. So Analysis Services 2012-2014 have a version of DAX that is very different from 2016 and later versions.
Okay.
And because I think that the number of existing models in 2012-2014 consumed by Power BI is relatively small, I will not be surprised that there are a number of combinations that don't generate good DAX code, or the result produced by DAX is not understood by the visual or the pipeline. So basically, I think that they don't have a full test coverage for all the cases for that old version. And potentially, I mean, it should work. I mean, if you open a ticket, you're working with a supported version of Analysis Services, with a supported version of Power BI, they should fix it. But I will not be surprised if at a certain point that they start to say, okay, this feature is not supported for Analysis Services 2012-2014 because they don't have a good way to translate into DAX code the request made by the visual. So this is the problem. The reason why this is not tested is because in my experience, most of the models that have been developed for that version of Analysis Services have been, and they have not been moved, upgraded to a new version of Analysis Services. They're consumed by Excel only. That's on average, this is the reason. If a company moves to Power BI, usually they also upgrade Analysis Services. There is also a very simple reason to do that, performance. The difference in performance between 2014 and 2016 and later versions is huge. So especially with Power BI. So I'm surprised that you actually have customers that are happy using that version, because if you decide that the report that doesn't work, every other report should be relatively slow.
Yeah, as always, big company, the IT is in Sweden in that case, and talking with that guy is not the easiest one. But okay, so I'm not alone with that issue, and you give me the proof that it's.
No, but I mean, if they call Microsoft, they have to support it. So just open a support ticket with is a Power BI problem. Okay, so you have to open a support ticket for Power BI.
Okay. You think it's could be solved on the Power BI side and not only with patches on the server side?
The error that you get is certainly okay. So if you get an error in Power BI, the error says what?
Unexpected error, and I have no access to the server logs, so I can rebuild.
Yes, but unexpected error. Okay, so if you okay, let me show you one thing. One thing you can do, you can connect it to, for example, if now I connect to Power BI, right? But imagine I connected to analysis services, okay, and I use all queries. When I do this, usually we don't use this because we have a performance analyzer, but this tool connected to analysis services capture all the queries coming to the server.
Yes, okay, good idea, but you need also sysadmin rights for that.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, sure. I hope that there maybe is a flag in Power BI desktop also logging all DAX queries independent if they are successful or not.
You have an option in Power BI, but I don't know if it helps. In the settings here, there is an option. Come on. Power BI doesn't load me. Okay, here we go. So here you have, let me check, diagnostic.
Diagnostics.
If you enable tracing here, not sure that it collects what we need.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
But if you try this, maybe that you can get something, and then you have to go in the traces folder, and so you close everything, you run this, you see the content of the folder, and you see. So you open this folder, and here you see what you have at the end, right? Maybe you have some, and the Microsoft support asks you to enable this to find these kind of bugs too.
Yeah, I have to check if it's only the Power Query stuff or also the DAX. But it's a good point. Yeah, thanks. I will check that.
Yeah, but no, this is something that could add something for the query too. Yeah, you have to try.
Yeah, yeah. But, all right, thanks.
But they had to upgrade. I mean.
Yeah, I will tell them. Maybe this year they will do. Or even just migrate to Power BI Premium. They have Premium, that's the crazy thing, but still running with an outdated tabular cube in the backend.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? You can unmute yourself.
Hello. Hi.
Yeah.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I just tried to on my machine show object that reference column, and I have the same let's say message undetected dependency. It could be that the German something with a locale, because I have also a German machine. I mean, in German, and it's I check them all. I check the compatibility level. It's also 1520. So yeah, it's something strange. Yeah.
But it could be some feature that you're using because we received we received this. If you look at this issue 388 on DAX Studio on GitHub, you will see that Darius spent some time, and I think that he also get, I don't remember if he got an example, but if you look at this, I think this is no, this is not in English, this is another language, but it's not German. It's not German, so yeah, and I don't know, but I think is maybe is dependency not allowed. No, this is English. You know what? It could be that in the tree. Okay. Okay, so I never investigated on this bug, but it could be the following. It could be that, so this view navigates the dependencies between the objects. It's possible that there is you're using one property or one object in the model that is not, I mean, the model I'm using here is very, very simple. I'm not using, all the properties of all the measures. Maybe there is some property that if you use that property, there is a bug in the view that no longer works now that we have the new format. And so if this is true, this would explain why it works in a model and doesn't work on another. In order to understand what is the problem that triggers the issue, we should investigate. But the thing is, this is a bug, so Microsoft should fix it. So instead of spending time finding why it doesn't work, I will spend time opening a ticket with the Microsoft support. Because I don't have a model that generates the problem, I cannot. But if I had if I was able to reproduce the problem, I will open a ticket with Microsoft saying, oh, look, you know what? This doesn't, I have Contoso that doesn't work. Even though I don't use Contoso in production, but I use Contoso for every training, so it has to work. So if I open a ticket, I have to fix it. So if you have something that you can share with Microsoft, it will be easy. If you cannot share the model with Microsoft, it's more complex because you have to provide them a way to reproduce the problem.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? One is in the waiting room. Okay. A little bit late.
Maybe could I ask a last question?
Yes, of course.
That would be great. It's not direct related to DAX Studio, more to the tabular editor.
Yeah, of course.
I'm trying now for weeks to figure out following scenario. If you have a Power BI desktop file where you have mscript queries which depend on other mscript queries, so you have a chain of queries in Power Query. If you connect to such a model in the tabular editor, you see the tables and you see the partition of that table with the uppermost query, the uppermost mscript query. Do you think there's any way we could navigate through the complete Power Query structure, or is that not exposed in the model or in the TOM definition of the tabular object model?
So it could be useful also to other people. Let me explain 1 second the question you made, which is the following. So a tabular editor is a tool that provides you access to the tabular model. And a tabular model is the structure that is behind analysis services, Power BI or Power Pivot. Now, the Power Query definition of the query that you define in Power Query is an M script that tabular editor shows here. And as of today, tabular editor doesn't have any tool to manage the M code, so the Power Query code. So what I'm saying is that from the point of view of Tabular Editor, this is text that doesn't have any meaning. Okay, so there is no knowledge about what is inside this. Now, in Power Query, you can create a query that calls another query that calls another query, and you can have a chain of dependencies. And this is simply ignored by Tabular Editor today. And there are two reasons for that. The first is that from the DOM point of view, this is just a string. There is no metadata on top of this. So from the point of view of the library we use, the Tabular Editor uses, there is no knowledge about that. And the second issue is that knowing this, you say, okay, what's the point? We can have we can have something that shows a better editor, or IntelliSense for all the features that we have for DAX, and we will have IntelliSense for DAX in Tabular Editor in the next big release. But it will be the best editor for DAX, not just a better one, the best. So better than Power BI, but that's just. But here for Power Query, the problem is that while we can discuss whether the DAX editor provided by Microsoft is good or not, okay, because we can discuss about the choices they made for the editor. Of course, we think that it could be better. But for Power Query, Microsoft already has a very good editor. The editor they built is very good. If you use when you go in Power BI and you go here, so beside the visual editor, right? Because the visual editor, okay, that is, but if you go here and you go here, 1 second, in this visualization, come on, here, view and advanced editor. This editor is wonderful. If you have a very long and complex script, you have IntelliSense, you have colors, you have everything you need here. The way they present this editor is very bad, because what I would like to have here is this with this. I click here and I switch between the source code without having to open and close the window every time. This is crazy.
Yeah, right? Point, yeah.
But so beside the user interface they created here, but this box here, this component is already good. And unfortunately, we already asked whether they would provide this component, because the easy thing to do would be, give me this code, give me this user experience, and put this user experience here. That's it. I mean, I don't need anything else. And unfortunately, the answer is no. So we don't have this. But the problem is that the amount of work required to create a good Power Query editor is too big to justify it in a tool that doesn't provide a Power Query user experience. So it doesn't make any sense. What I would expect, the day that Microsoft starts to contribute to the open source tool, this is the first thing that they could do.
Yeah, I mean, the UI is one thing. The other thing is where that information, that meta information is stored about the chain, because if you export that complete tabular as a JSON, you will not find that subquery.
Okay. No? I took it for granted. If you have this, it is not just the editor. This is the parser behind. And the parser behind has the knowledge of what you're doing. So the name, if I reference another query here, or a hidden query here, the editor is aware of that, because otherwise it wouldn't have IntelliSense and other things. So it's implicit that if you have the editor, you have the parser, and you have the knowledge of all the dependencies. It's automatic. It's in the package. So when I say I need
file, you mean, no? The PBX file that stores that information.
No, the PBX file. The set of the queries you have. So if you look at what you have here, this list of queries, regardless of the format, you have a list of M scripts that are, autonomous. They don't depend on the Power BI file. They could be extracted and used as text files if you want.
Mm.
So in principle, if I have this, if I have this, I can, and I have access to the libraries of Power Query, I can infer the structure of the table that I get as an output, and I can create the columns of the table. Make sense? Because the problem is, how can we know that the result of this has online sales key, store key, product key? Because if you look at the code here, you don't see the name of the columns, right? So this is not enough. But if you have a library that you can run, what happens is that when it runs the preview, it generates the metadata that is used to infer the columns. And this is the part that we don't have, and it's almost impossible to have. So what we have here, we know that this text, which is just a string, will generate something that fits into these three columns, each of one has a specific data type and so on. If something goes wrong, so if this query at query time doesn't provide me the three columns I need, I get an error. The problem is that how can you enable an experience where you imagine that you have an empty tabular model, you paste this code in a new table, how can you get these three columns with the right data type? You needed a Power Query engine that runs in preview and provides you the metadata.
Yeah.
So
interesting. I think we have to need to have patience.
The problem is that it doesn't make sense to create another Power Query engine. That's my point, because if you want to run this, you have to be able to run any any M query in any connector. But why? You already have Power Query that does this. The easiest thing to do is to just run the script in the Power Query engine and get the metadata as a result, just like Power BI does. But the problem is that this API is not exposed, the editor is not exposed, the parser is not exposed. It's all embedded into Power BI and not provided to other tools.
Yeah. Let's be patient, and if you look at the roadmap from the data flows where you have the JSON file where you can import that complete M script chains, I think maybe that will come in future.
Yeah, that could be an idea. But
it would be even great if you have a button in the Power Query editor of Power BI Desktop to export the complete Power Query step as a JSON and then import it as a data flow in the service. It's not possible also, but I think, that will be great for the lift and shift story if that would be possible.
It's not possible because not all of the connectors are supported in Dataflow, I think. But for the supported connector, you're right. I don't see any problem in doing this. Actually, I did this at the very beginning. I found a lot of bugs because in a beta, I made this, so I tried to copy the queries from Power BI to Dataflow, and there were a lot of bugs, a lot of things that were not supported. But now it should be close enough, so I expect it to work on 99% of the queries. So you're right. But why you want to create data flows for every table and then import them? I'm not sure it's a good
story. If you just want to migrate your Power BI Desktop solution to a data flow based solution, then you have to export that stuff, or even if you want automation where you have a template
I
file.
agree. I don't understand why. I mean, I'm not saying that it is I'm not saying that it is something that doesn't make sense. I'm saying that it's something that I will not do by default. It's a use case that it should not be so common, especially once I know that we will get the composite models between different data sets. So why would you move to the data flow, all the data that then you import in Power BI?
The biggest advantage is data flow versus Power BI desktop, that you don't need a gateway for authoring new reports. No, often you have the source behind the firewall.
No.
And that's great. Then
this is a very, very good point. But I would add that at that point, it could be useful also to define the relationships in the data flow.
Yeah, maybe.
And the funny thing is that you can, but it's not exposed.
Okay.
If you look at the documentation, the data flow can have the relationships.
Yeah, it's the data flags or the CDS, no?
But you cannot. You don't have a UI to do this.
For sure, you have to be patient.
Yeah, no. It's one of the things that because that is interesting. I agree that if you see the data flow as a sort of a data lake or a data mart, that makes sense to avoid a gateway. It makes sense, yes. But the gateway, you use the gateway. Okay, for the authoring. You're right. Yes. No, you're right. For that use case, you're right. I agree. It's a good idea.
All right, great talk. Thanks again.
Okay. I think we don't have any questions left. Marco, thank you very much. And when you are next time in Germany, or we see us on a conference, I will pay the pizza.
I hope so. I have the feeling that we hope to do this in 2021. Certainly not this year, but hopefully soon. In the meantime, we do this training, these virtual things, and we continue to work a lot, producing content and so on.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was very great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Stop the video.